House Speaker Michael Madigan said he didn't want to make headlines, and then he did. We'll talk about that next on Capitol View. It was at a speech at the City Club of Chicago. Asked a question about how high Illinois' taxes should go, House Speaker Michael Madigan said, "I don't want to make headlines." That got a laugh from the crowd. Then he went on to say, we should start at that 5% that it was back in 2014. Of course, that did make headlines. We'll talk about that on this edition of Capitol View. I'm Amanda Vinicky, State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS in Springfield. And I am joined by two friends and colleagues, Hannah Meisel, also of Public Radio, Illinois Public Media, that's WILL in Champaign, and Andy Maloney with the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. So, this was a rare speech for House Speaker Michael Madigan. We've heard from him more this year than in prior years. He's known for playing things pretty close to the vest, but as Illinois has been at this historic, unprecedented budget impasse, we've actually had frequent visits from the House Speaker, also, of course, Chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, Madigan, down in, we call it the Blue Room, because there's, a blue velvet curtain where newsmakers can stand at a podium and give their briefings. It seemed like much of the speech was a repeat of what we've heard from them, right, Hannah? Can you give some of the highlights?
Yeah, I feel like we could all recite some of, at least, the Speaker's speech in our sleep by now. He called for, again, moderation by all negotiating parties, but what he's really directing to is to Governor Rauner. And he talked about what he calls the core values of both the Democratic and Republican parties, which means what he's really getting at is that he will not bend to the governor's will, weakening labor unions. He talked a little bit more in depth about the services that Illinois is not being able to provide right now that we are almost to month 6 of this budget impasse. And, he then, like you mentioned at the top, he got some interesting questions from the audience, and that's when he did, some might say stumble and show his cards, and he said, we might want to start at that 5% rate that we had for 4 years prior to January. And, that is one cause of what could be a huge catastrophe. Once the budget impasse is solved, we're still going to have a major, major shortfall of money, and we don't know what's going to happen.
So let me read the actual statement from Speaker Madigan, because he ended up actually issuing a clarification, said that a lot of the headlines got it wrong. As reporters, we know we don't always write the headlines. There are folks that do that, especially for newspapers. And of course, it's just that. It's a headline. It's a quick couple of words in bold. You're supposed to actually read the story, get the context. But the headlines had things like, Madigan wants 5% tax increase or 5% tax rate. What he actually said was, a good place to begin, he repeated himself, would be the level we were at before the income tax expired. And starting there, you could go in whatever direction you want to go, meaning, up or down. So he said starting there, but very much the message, and you saw Republicans pounce on this right away before it was even done. I think I had emails come in through my inbox, and the Twitter sphere was blowing up a bit about this. Madigan wants a tax increase. As Hannah put it, it seemed as if Republicans were saying Democrats have finally showed their cards. Andy, this seems to me from watching things as if Republicans were really poking for this to happen for a while, and Madigan didn't think he was falling into the trap, but he did anyway? Is this just he's not up to current trends in social media and discourse? He thought he was being funny and more nuanced and they didn't get it? Or did he really show his cards and Republicans are right?
It's a great question, perhaps not with a clear answer, at least for me, but this is something that's newsmakers try to do all the time. Madigan himself is very good at it, and that's part of the reason for his longevity is they sort of avoid giving such granular details when they're talking about policy proposals. Even if it's something that people know, they back and they're trying to do. Unless something's already out there on the table, they're usually going to go to pretty great lengths to avoid saying the numbers. And when we as reporters, when the public hears a specific number, it's pretty easy to say, here's what was on his mind, was 5%. So I don't think that's an unreasonable conclusion to draw from his statements earlier this week, that he's at least hoping that some kind of deal, or that he can will the increase to kind of go back to where it was. Whether it'll be a potent issue for Republicans in the next election is maybe a more confusing question, because the governor has said he wants to raise taxes too. He hasn't hid that. But what he hasn't done is
wants
give
to
that,
might not be.
or
I don't think anybody wants it.
He said he is willing to.
There we go.
He is willing to raise taxes, even though he has an aversion to it. I think a lot of people have an aversion to it, but regardless, he hasn't given that kind of specific number. So if you're a Republican in a legislative race, or you're a Republican leader, it's very easy now to point out, hey, he wants it back to 5%. You guys remember, you
It's
folks
like lob off the whole second sentence.
you folks in
and he said
Illinois
it.
remember what you were paying when this income tax increase that we hated. We as Republicans can come out and say we hated it. And so now the speaker wants to go back there.
Not to mention, the business community has mentioned on several occasions that they don't mind whatever tax, within reason, but they want to be certaintied, I guess. They want to know what's going to happen. They can't weather the jumping up and down of a rate. They can't weather, the constant changing of regulations. They just can't move that fast.
Maybe they can't handle uncertainty that comes with, oh wait, not having a budget. I think that has been for sure cause for consternation on all corners. But yeah, it's interesting to me because Republicans were so quick to lash out at the speaker, and twofold. First of all, Republicans themselves, it's not just the governor saying he's willing, but I mean, there has been rank and file Senate Minority Leader Christine Radogno came out and said, this is outrageous out of Madigan. We need reforms first. Although she herself has been one to say, yes, I recognize a tax increase will be needed. There was number one, but also that it took so long for Madigan to be out with the statement, quote unquote, clarifying. I mean, whether you call it backpedaling, because maybe that was what it was, or perhaps it was instead that he hadn't intended for it to be taken as it was portrayed by either Republicans. I don't know why he wouldn't have thought that would happen, or the media, but nonetheless, it wasn't until that night. I mean, it just seemed too late for the speaker to be out clarifying his message, where I, as political advisors, I'd say, okay, you're talking to the press afterwards, you need to clarify.
Yeah, and maybe it was by then that they sort of saw the crush of headlines that he did end up making that say, Speaker wants to go back to 5%, Speaker wants income tax increase, et cetera. But it's an interesting, parsing what the Speaker says is always something that we do here, and this is just sort of another element that it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
Well, right, because whenever you're doing politics, it's parsing what he says and what he means, what will happen. But there's also, this is politics. It's how it plays in the public at large. And these headlines are now out there. I do think they're going to be used in plenty of election fodder brochures. There's already been a lot of effort by the Rauner campaign to make it be a versus Madigan, not even as much about the policy on things, but it's, Madigan's the bad guy. So elections, second question would be, either of you, do you think this will change now negotiations? Does Rauner have any advantage as there's still no budget and he's still pressing for these controversial aspects of the turnaround agenda? Has Madigan lost ground?
I think he might have lost a bit of ground. I think that Madigan before was able to point to the many items on Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda and say, this is unacceptable, this is unacceptable, and things on the Democratic side were a little bit more, not as tangible, I would say. There weren't so many numbers attached to them, whereas on the Republican side, we didn't have numbers for a very long time, but in this year since the governor has been sworn in, he has had to clarify and specify some things. So yes, I do think that the speaker has lost a little bit of ground, but I also don't think that, it's not a race. Obviously, they are in no hurry to solve this budget impasse as a whole. I don't think that it's going to be the biggest deal in the world, but yes, I can see, like you said, Governor Rauner's people coming out with some very good, very well-produced ads, using those, 3 to 5 seconds and, putting a dark filter over it and, dark storm clouds and, much the same as we have already seen.
Right. I mean, it seems like for the turnaround agenda efforts, things that Bruce Rauner wants, you have workers' compensation out there, the business community wants it, some trial efforts, these kind of feel-good measures that are meant to appeal to the public when it comes to term limits and redistricting, and then it gets into the union stuff, and there is a built-in base of no. The people who want it are not perhaps as organized, or that doesn't play as well with the public in headlines, but now there's a combating headline. There are people who will come out against any sort of tax increase, and they're all there. But let's move on just real quick. Actually, Hannah, you listened to the rest of the speech. This was clearly, again, despite Madigan's wishes, what he didn't want to make headlines did, but was there any other takeaways, anything that you thought that was different or interesting from his remarks?
There was a question from a man who runs, I didn't quite understand what company it was or what organization, but I believe that he made loans to businesses that are owned by women and minorities, which are, historically businesses that are very, very hard to get off the ground if you're one of those populations. And the state does give out some money to those organizations so they can distribute and help those business owners. And so the speaker, he said, yeah, it's terrible that we're not paying them right now. And I think it was probably one of the most solid declarations from him before, because like you said, we have seen more of him this year than ever before, surely, but he has the gift of being very detached, very,
He's careful about his words.
He's very careful. And so I thought that was interesting. Mm-hmm. And then you had, he also got a question from a labor leader who it gave him maybe a softball, saying that, back in 2011, we already did workers' compensation reform. Just talk a little bit about how well that's working. And so the speaker got
and
to...
is Illinois going to go after insurance at all? Yeah. An industry that traditionally in Illinois has had a lot of legislators on its side and therefore been graced without the regulations that other states have. Some of my takeaways from the Madigan speech, I thought he gave a bit of a window into his philosophy of government when he talked about going back to 1933 and FDR and how government plays a role in people's lives, and also mentioned that he'd asked the governor a little bit about when is Illinois going to not run out of money but not be able to make payments to schools, and that he didn't buy the governor's answer that it wasn't going to be a problem. So that may be something for us to all look for on the horizon as we figure out this new territory that Illinois has never been in before. Madigan was also asked after the public portion of this by reporters, do you weigh in at all? Should the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, resign? And should the Department of Justice extend its investigation in the Chicago Police Department to Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez? That is somebody who in the past has had Madigan's support. So a little bit of city politics here, but it veers off, of course, into state politics. Madigan said he hadn't had time still to consider either of those, though it's been 2 weeks since a video was released of a Chicago police officer shooting 16 times a black teenager in Chicago, Laquan McDonald. So, Andy, there are a couple of ways in which state legislators are now getting involved in this, right?
Yeah, one of them was a bill filed by Representative LaShawn Ford. Mm-hmm. And basically what it would do was create a path by which the citizens could recall the mayor, basically kick him out of office. It would require several thousand signatures, the endorsement or the backing of at least 2 city aldermen. Whether it becomes a viable plan down the road or not, it seems too difficult politically to get done, especially in this environment where the focus is going to be on budgeting stuff, or at least what appears to be a budgeting process. It's one of those bills that you see, and it's meant as, it's almost you can interpret it as like a thermometer of this is how far it's gotten when a legislator, a state lawmaker, wants to jump in on this issue.
And a Democrat,
a Chicago Democrat, right. Things are getting pretty serious, to say the least.
Not looking good for Rahm.
Not looking good. His approval numbers are down. He's at like 18%. 51% of people in one poll said that he should resign in the wake of this incident. I think for citizens in Chicago, the worst part may be the old question of what he knew and when he knew it, because the video, there were some indications that his staff knew about it before his reelection, and then kept it quiet. And then immediately after he's reelected, the city signs off on a $5 million settlement for the family, but even though they hadn't filed a lawsuit. So there's a lot going on here, a lot of anger.
Protests continue.
Protests continue in Chicago, and it's tumultuous for the mayor.
And the other state angle is that the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus has come together and asked that that Department of Justice investigation do be expanded to Alvarez's office. Alvarez facing two primary opponents, including one who has the backing of many state lawmakers. What's interesting to me as I think about this is, first of all, a recall. Yeah, I don't think, even if you could get a bill through, there would be perhaps legal issues, because would the mayor be able to be recalled if he wasn't elected under the terms of that? And of course, he just got through an election. Right. But, Andy, would there be anything to say it's best to keep Rahm in, even if you do believe that he was in the wrong and at fault for, it's not just the Laquan McDonald incident, we've had other videos issued and more soon to perhaps be released. Do you see any different thought there?
There is a counter argument, I think, that could be made that despite what are perceived as failings of the mayor and his police department and the state's attorney's office and whoever else, that he is a guy who is very familiar with the machine or the organization that is Chicago government, and how it works. He's familiar with different...
And darn good at pulling those strings.
And can pull some strings, right. He can make some deals. He's got knowledge of the game. And you can make the argument that you don't want to take somebody out of office right when you're on the cusp of sort of all those types of big reforms. You want somebody who knows what they're doing, arguably.
Would be able to pass them.
Right, would be able to get them through. And like you said, he was just elected, so that maybe takes some of the bite out of that criticism. Now, obviously, there's still a lot of people upset, and a lot of people believe that when you find that somebody is, not paying close enough attention to the situation, or may have been at fault, or even may have covered stuff up, the best way to go about is to clean house. All we're saying, I think, is the counter argument for some could be that having an experienced government person in office could also be beneficial.
And there is no real great plan for setting up a possible replacement for Rahm Emanuel either. It would be kind of a second in command, somebody who also is not thought to have been on the forefront of those who say that blacks are at a disadvantage, and particular from the police department.
Right, and let's say, for instance, that Representative Ford's bill does get through. I mean, what is the timeline for replacement? The vice mayor steps in for a period of time, but it's only a matter of, I think, a couple of months before you have to find a successor. And the DNA of an election is that you typically have more time than that.
So much there, and this has caught national news, and of course has a lot to do with what can or can't pass here in Springfield when you have Chicago legislators who really have a big power base in the General Assembly that need to be on board with things. The legislature did, however, come together, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, and in quick fashion, you had the House last week, and then on Monday, the state Senate, just a couple of hours later, Governor Bruce Rauner signing into law a stopgap budget. Hannah, what are some of the details that are included in this? About $3 billion.
About $3 billion, and it includes $1 billion for the lottery, We had headlines, I think, late summer, early fall. People were winning the lottery and not being able to get paid. They were getting IOUs. And that made national news, as it's wont to do, because, that's unusual. We also have more important but less dollars, $28 million thereabouts to domestic violence shelters. Other money finally going to cities and towns. This is actually money that the cities and towns owns, for lack of a better word, but was just being held by the state. And as we get into the winter months, thank goodness it's been pretty clear. In December, I think we had a freak snowstorm in November, but
it's been like balmy.
Yeah,
It has
gorgeous. That's what you get.
Yeah, it's like April, but haven't needed road salt.
Yes, but we will. There is no doubt we will. We live in Illinois. We live in, and so, it could get dangerous if you have, especially the smaller cities who already have budget issues. There are countless cities and towns around Illinois who have very serious budget issues that are being overshadowed and in some cases exacerbated by the state budget impasse. And so they will finally get this money, and that's a very good thing.
Is it interesting to anybody else that we still have state universities don't have any money? There are pockets of social service areas, for example, while domestic violence was funded, sexual assault was not. There's some mental health funding. There's plenty that is still up in the air there. But lottery winners are getting paid. Is this a game of perception at this point, or are these true priorities?
Yeah, you should go to Google News and type in Illinois lottery budget and see how many national hits you get. It's bound to be a lot of them. So yeah, I do think that part of this at least is shoring up kind of the outside perception. There's no doubt that there were some good things in here, but for the most part, this is one deal out of a lot more deals that may be yet to come. We don't know.
Is it a
if
sign?
anything, it's encouraging. I think there's no doubt. You had legislators, like you said, for the first time on the floor saying, yeah, we actually did a pretty good job here. Democrats and Republicans came together. Some of the comments were barbed a little bit. I think some on the Democratic side saying, well, the governor's finally governing, or some on the Republican side saying, or Democrats are finally coming to the table. But I think it's encouraging.
Okay. And do we think there was yet another leaders meeting? This one was not at all in front of the public, no posturing for the press beforehand, but leaders came out, they said some minor progress. Again, good signs, hope there. It seems like there's going to be another one of these next week. Hannah, any takeaways?
I'm so glad that I think everyone in Illinois is glad that they're at least meeting, and that is encouraging. We did see the political theater last week when they had the for the cameras meeting basically, but we have, like you said, we still have billions more to go.
I think the higher ed and really Chicago Public Schools are going to be the next forefronts of this fight.
Yes, because those two can really, really come to a crisis because they affect, some of the most vulnerable young people in our state. I live and report in the Champaign-Urbana area.
We're in fact actually both employed by the University of Illinois, which is seen as the school that really, out of any of the rest, could withstand it above the others.
Right. But 60 miles south is Eastern Illinois University, who is already struggling. They've been struggling for a couple years now, and they had to lay off people in the beginning of the year. They have said that they are not sure about the students who they've promised MAP grants to. MAP grants are the money for poorer students who are able to go to college. And then this week, Western Illinois University over in Macomb, they announced that they might have to lay off.
Are laying off, right?
Yes, are laying off 50 faculty staff. 50 out of 200. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of people, and I don't know if you've ever been to Macomb, but it's not much.
The university is the driver.
Yes, exactly. And so when you start losing those people, they're gone. Like, it's going to be very hard to get them back if they go through the process of selling their house, if they go through the process of uprooting their family. They're not going to come back, and then you have to recruit more people when
And recruiting students, it's
Right.
really a spiral.
it really is.
So we'll be watching that, of course, on Capitol View. I wanted to get in, there was some news about medical marijuana. It's been about 1 month since patients were able to get that. We have that. And then also on the drug front, Representative Kelly Cassidy, also a Chicago Democrat, has some legislation having to do with cannabis, right, Andy?
Cannabis, right. This is a decriminalization bill, essentially. She had it earlier in the year, but Governor Rauner made some changes to it, called for some changes, wanted some of the limits for non-criminal possession to be lowered. Didn't want to take as drastic of a step. And Representative Cassidy initially said this was shocking and felt like the rug had gotten swept out from under her. But this week came back, reintroduced the bill with largely the governor's changes still intact. So there wasn't a whole lot of change. You can look at that politically as saying maybe they didn't want to give the governor a victory on that. But all in all, overall, if you look at the criminal justice movement, it's some of the more low-hanging fruit. So we'll have to see how this plays next session and then how similar reforms play after that.
And the point being to try and reduce the prison population, also because the thought is that the minorities are really more disadvantaged by going to jail, having it on their record for
Right.
having possession of small amounts of cannabis.
Right, and with medical cannabis in play, like you said, this also sets a legal threshold for driving while influenced by cannabis. It's a 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood or something. So that's another, that's part of that bill.
Well, that is about all the time we have today. Wanted to everybody take note of Andy's jacket here. It is one in the Illinois State Senate chambers. If you're a man, you have to be wearing a blazer in order to enter. So a lot of the press room folk keep spare jackets. This is one of Kurt Erickson, who has since left the Illinois Press Corps to join Missouri's. We will, of course, miss him. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amanda Vinicky, joined today by Andy Maloney of the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin and Hannah Meisel of Illinois Public Media and WILL. I'm with Illinois Public Radio and WUIS. Check us out on Facebook at Capitol View Politics. Thanks so much.